I learned really quickly that you can plan all you want, but you have very little control.
All right, welcome back to the Active Mom Postpartum podcast. I am incredibly excited to have my friend and also my website person, which I never knew. It took a long time to realize that. Maria Alcoke is on with us this morning, and how I met Maria was completely random. We met at a continuing education course that you happened to be at, and pregnant with number 2.
Number
Yes,
2.
yeah. And, you had a podcast back then, and I kind of was like, this girl is super cool. And like a couple years later, I was like, you do website stuff, and will you do mine? And so you've been a great supporter for a long time. And I was like, you need to come on and talk about your mom experience. And you were also a coach. So why don't we just dive in, and you can kind of share a little bit about yourself, and then we'll see where this goes.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Carrie, thanks for having me. This is fun because, yeah, as Carrie mentioned, I had a podcast it was 18 months and it felt like a really long time, but
Yeah.
18 months in the grand scheme is a little bit of a short stint for podcasting. But I was really inspired to get into coaching because I had gone through my first pregnant and postpartum experience very clueless with very little guidance. But my background in fitness had spanned for many, many years, teenage athlete, not so much college, but I was into fitness, got into CrossFit, and I found that there was a lack of support within that space for women that were pregnant or postpartum. A lot of women ended up leaving the gym. A lot of women ended up not really committing to get back into it after the fact. And so I thought, well, there's this gap, and I'd love to be somebody who can fill that gap. But also, as I was getting my certificate in postpartum coaching, prenatal and postpartum coaching, I got pregnant with my second. So it was kind of just like, selfishly a way for me to educate myself and then also
Yeah.
bring that to other women. And so I ran a postpartum program for specific to CrossFit and sort of getting back into like high intensity exercise and weight training and that sort of style of training. And I did that for, I want to say it was almost a year until life got really crazy with the second kid. As you know, you've got
Right.
a new baby. I had a podcast. I also, as Carrie mentioned, do web development and graphic design. So it was like all these different things. And so now I've sort of honed in on the design work. That's sort of like my bread and butter these days, but I still have a huge passion for fitness and coaching. And when I can take my creative side and my fitness passion and kind of merge them and work with people like Carrie, it's like a dream come true. So this is super fun. It's been great to watch you grow too as a professional. And I'm grateful shout out to Anthony Lowe for that
Yes,
postpartum.
we're chatting tomorrow morning at 6 AM.
Well, you have to say hello.
Yes, I
He's
will, I
wonderful.
will.
Yeah.
No, that's gonna be one of the conversations, like, "Hey, do you know how many people you've impacted here?"
Yeah.
And, you're one of those. So, yes, I guess I have to thank him for all of that too.
He's a good
Definitely.
contact for
He
sure.
is, he is. So for you, like, and you were incredibly active before having your kids. Like, what was your how did you expect it was all going to go? What did you envision your postpartum period looking like? What did you envision what being active was going to look like before you had your daughter?
So I'll talk to my first pregnancy.
Yeah.
Before she was born, before I got pregnant with Sage, that's my number one. I was endurance athlete, so running, swimming. I did triathlons, I did marathons, but I also did strength and conditioning, similar to CrossFit. And so after Sage was born, I had a crazy, I would say crazy, but a birth that was unexpected, right? I learned really quickly that you can plan all you want, but you have very little control.
Yeah.
So it was, 36 some hour labor. I pushed for 3 hours. I ended up with a C-section. So it was kind of like I got hit by a bus and
That
then I
was
got
me
cut
too.
open. Yeah. So I think and I think I've heard that experience from a lot of women. And a part of me thinks like, could it have been, related to the way I was training when I was pregnant? But I had no idea. I didn't have any guidance. I kind of just did what felt good or what felt right
Yeah.
and looked to the limited resources that were out there back then. Like this was like 2015. And then so postpartum, I really did take my time easing back in. One, I think it was because I didn't have access to a gym. I think if I had had access to a gym, meaning like I had, a CrossFit class or something to return to, I probably would have just like thrown myself right back in at that 6 week mark. But I didn't have that. I actually moved from California back to Maryland. So I was in search of community, looking for a gym, looking for a place
Mm,
to train. And so it was almost like I kind of just imagined I would go back to doing what I was always doing, but I didn't really have the choice.
right.
So I just kind of did, I did a lot of walking, did a lot of light training in my parents' basement. We were living in my parents at the time. It was a very different life. Um, but definitely not as I had envisioned it.
Yeah.
I was definitely still active, but it was a different experience compared to number two, which is I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
Yeah. And so at what point did you kind of start to transition into coaching? Was it that when you kind of found your community when you got to Maryland or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was in California, I taught at the gym that I was training at. I coached endurance, or I called it a speed class. So it was all about speed training that helped to contribute to endurance. And so
Mhm.
I mean, my go-to was running when I was postpartum with Sage. And then when I found the CrossFit gym, that became more of, I mean, if those who are familiar with CrossFit, it's a lot more, it's conditioning, but it's also weight training, it's gymnastics. And so I had the opportunity to start coaching there. I had discussed, my previous background in coaching, and they said, well, you've got some flexibility. You're a parent, you're freelancing, but you're also have this extra time. Are you interested in coaching? And I said, sure, I'll get my level one and see where that takes me. And it was a combination of the community itself and the ability to connect with people that I love. I'm a
Yeah, you're so
extrovert.
good at that, yeah.
Yeah, and it felt very natural to go into the coaching space. And then it was when I was coaching CrossFit when I started to realize there's a lot of women that were either getting pregnant or coming back from pregnancy, and I thought, maybe there's more support and guidance that we can give them because some of them were, either having issues recovering postpartum
Right,
or were finding themselves, really training hard pregnant, but then having that lack of support and time and energy and all those things postpartum, it was almost like they felt discouraged because they couldn't get back to that level so quickly. So
right.
that's definitely when the idea to start looking at certificates and just getting more educated came in.
Yeah. So then somewhere in there you get pregnant with Hendrix, like, now you've got knowledge. What do you do with it?
Yeah, and that's just something Carrie and I talked about this post record, but it was like, you go from being like almost ignorant and just like in this blissful ignorance to knowing too much almost, right? And being
Right.
so delicate I mean, I think about having like hearing some of the the fear mongering language, which was very prevalent, I feel like back in 2016 through maybe 2019,
Yeah,
and it wasn't to shame women, but I think it was to keep them aware and to also help sort of put some people into check, right? Because I think as athletes, you're like, I got this. I got the birth. I got the postpartum. I don't need to, I'm going to be recovered. I'm going to be fine. Um, and everyone's experience is different, but it definitely makes puts you into check. It gets you to realize that like just because I was a really fantastic athlete and recovered prior to having a baby doesn't mean that it's not going to be just like a snap of a finger. We're back at it. I
right.
found that the 6 week, clears for exercise was such BS, right? Like what does
Yeah,
that mean? And there was no context, for what does that mean? Like, that means can I run? But what's my distance? And what happens if I have incontinence? What happens if I mean, I didn't know, to be honest, and I almost embarrassed to admit this, I didn't know what the pelvic floor was until I opened that textbook to start reading about, you know, the the
but
female
why would
anatomy,
you? Yeah, but why
you
but why
know?
would you, quite honestly?
Yeah.
When we were talking earlier, my son's getting the sex talk today in 5th grade, and the neighbor across the street got the talk appropriate for 4th graders, and it was basically when a boy sperm meets a girl egg and then they make a baby. Like, if that's all we get about our anatomy and we get about the pelvis, like, that's not cool either.
No,
And
they don't give
so
it to you.
no, and so I mean that I think that's an assumption that I have when I talk to women is like, okay, I know the last time we chatted about this was 5th grade health class, and we start with it, you get that basic like cross section of, bladder, uterus, and you kind of forget that the rectum's back there too. So
Yeah.
if that's what you're based upon, like imagining a 3D muscle that also incorporates with your back and your hip and organs and all these other things, like I'm in this field and it's still incredibly challenging to kind of wrap your head around what that looks like. And this is in our body and we just have no sense of it and people want to avoid it, or avoid talking about it. I just think it's so for you, you talk about fear mongering language and that kind of stuff. Like, what was kind of the stuff that you would hear that was kind of meant to kind of tone things down or get you to be worried or, aware at least?
Well, I think everyone's favorite buzzword, diastasis
Oh,
recti
good
or
Lord.
mommy tummy or what, whatever the
Yeah.
specific DR. And it was like, okay, don't, how dare you consider doing gymnastics or kipping or doing anything that's going to increase coning. And coning was like a big thing. And I remember being like, don't be coning, you know?
Right.
And so
Right.
for the longest time, that was sort of like my go-to cue was to like, okay, try to avoid coning or try to it was there was no strategy. And so as I started to get educated, I was like, okay, it's more than just a modification. It's more than just a avoid, do this, not that. It's
Right.
how can we breathe differently? I mean, to your point with like, we haven't really understood our bodies since maybe, yeah, fifth grade sex ed. It's almost like having to relearn so much more. It's like relearn how we hold our breath, how we hold our stress. I know for certain when I'm stressed, which is a higher percentage of my life these days, it's up in here and I'm not belly breathing. And God forbid you let your belly relax because then you're just
Right.
like, we're like loose, hanging out, whatever. And it's like something that it's just having to retrain so much. And if we could start that conversation, like pull back and start that conversation earlier, people in general would feel more comfortable and confident in exercise, in conversation around it, and asking questions. I mean, I think about so many things that I was like embarrassed to ask my doctor, even with like my C-section. I was not told, or at least I don't remember being told, that you actually can wash I had like the glue, and I
Right.
didn't clean that off because I was afraid that if I did,
Right.
something
You
was
don't
gonna
want to
happen.
split open. Right.
Uh-huh. And so then as a result, I had this big keloid scar, which was then resolved in my second C-section. But it's just like, why is it so
Basic
taboo to
things.
have conversations about our bodies?
Or it's just an assumption that you should know this because, by the way, I know you just got split open like a fish, 4 weeks ago, but yeah, you should go be out doing all these extra things. And by the way, there's glue. Like,
Yeah, right. Little details like that. Well, even,
yeah.
I mean, I think you were one of the first people. I think one of the resources that I had gotten from you was the C-section scar massage. And then
Yeah.
that was one, it's a little bit daunting, but I remember thinking like, this is stuff that they just never talk to you about. And I'm
No.
not shaming the OBGYNs or the midwives, right? Like it's not that they are trying to withdraw that information or withhold that information. It's just that there's so much and they only have so much time, with each
Right.
patient. So, and I mean, gosh, moms don't have a ton of free time to do their own research. And then, of course, if
Right.
you do, then of course it's very likely you end up in that rabbit hole of like, don't do this or you'll get DR and you'll be ruined. And it's just like,
Right. Well, and
what do
that's
I
the
do?
thing too, is like and especially the last couple of years, I feel like there's so much more information. It's like you're kind of stuck in this pendulum of there's so much that you know nothing, and then now there's too much that you're like, okay, how do I even figure out what it is that I need? And the diastasis recti, I think, is such a great one because I had it after my second, and that's how I connected with Anthony Lowe was, everything that we had been taught in PT school was, you know, put the two sides together, and if you train them together, then they will eventually. No, it doesn't work that way.
There was like a towel. Like,
Oh,
just use
yes,
the
you
towel.
yes, yes,
Ugh.
you wrap it around and then you pull across and you work it doesn't freaking work that way, but around here, I joke that, like, 98% of the DMV thinks that they have it and most don't, but it's a gateway. I call it a gateway diagnosis because you might come to me for that, but you might not come to me on your own for leakage or pain with sex or things like that. But the diastasis, you'll come for that. I'll be Oprah and give everything back to you, but let's treat these other things. Let's talk about these other things. But no, you're totally right. Like and I think it was kind of on both sides too. It's like we didn't really help things either because we were along the lines of, okay, don't do the sit-ups. I remember back 2013, like CrossFit was the devil in my profession. Like when they're like, okay, it's totally fine to pee when you jump or lift. And all we had was like, no, don't do it. Like CrossFit is bad, but we didn't have a solution. Like, how can you do those things and maybe not have those symptoms? We're just like, don't do that. So I don't think we helped as a profession either. So
The well, it's not an industry, but the concept of like supporting postpartum women is definitely evolved, right? Like it's just one of those things where
yes.
people get more educated, and I mean, I think I would definitely call you one of the most progressives I know, because you're on, like, you're in the field, you're working with women, you understand how language is important, and it just you are I think I love the myth busting and all of the messaging that you have around supporting women postpartum. It's like empowering, as opposed to the fear mongering, or just like it
Yeah.
almost makes you want to just shut down. And I found that similarly with Anthony. It was like, just empowering people to say like, well, just because this isn't working for you doesn't mean that you can't do it. Let's find an alternative
Right.
that can get you to where you want to be.
Right.
And that just gives, you feel like you lose a lot of yourself when you become a mom. And if you can find something that brings you back to sort of that
Yeah.
place of like, oh, here I am, like whether
Yep.
it's if running or training or whatever it may be, but
Yeah.
moving your body is part of, feeling alive, and you need
Yeah.
that.
Well, and I think for me, I mean, I don't know that I thought that something bad would happen or I would have leakage or prolapse or diastasis, which I had all those. Um, and I think I thought that, oh, I knew these things, I could prevent this from happening, which, got smacked in the face on that. I don't know if I would have had an appreciation as I do now if I hadn't gone through this stuff. So some days, when you're in it, it kind of stinks. But on the other hand, it's like I think when you have a couple of kids, you thought that you had the knowledge and you literally have to step back and be like, wow, what I might have been teaching people was not serving them. I either have to accept that my profession has limitations, or I say, screw that, and I find another alternative that's not there and be open to voices that are like, well, hey, we don't know this for sure, but let's try this. Like, again, I don't know that if I hadn't gone through that, if I would have been as open because I was desperate too. I was like, I want to be able to do these things. And, I started CrossFit when my youngest was 3. Like, that's humbling as hell to walk into a CrossFit box, number 1, not knowing what the hell you're talking about, and 2, feeling like you're jacked up postpartum and you've got all
Yeah.
these issues. So, we'll thank whoever planned all this out.
Yeah.
But to your point too, you brought up, like, kind of the holistic piece of this. And I think, you're such a great example of this too, that you're like, yeah, I've got this stress, but you show up every day in your gym, your garage gym, and do the stuff that you need to do. And especially the last couple years, I don't think people realize how much of how they've held themselves or tried to hold their family together in the context of global pandemic and no childcare and all that other stuff, how it translates to how we breathe, as you mentioned, our tension, all that other stuff. And I don't think I was really aware of it as much until I started just doing telehealth and never touching a client, never being able to do that physical exam, but just being like, hey, where are you holding your tension? Where are you holding your breath? And being able to impact symptoms just on that alone. I was like, wait a second. There's far more to it than how you pick up a kettlebell. There's far more to it than coning, like you said. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, I mean, when I think about how you served an entire population of people via telehealth, like that's amazing because then you're actually encouraging body awareness. Because
right?
I think a lot of times we're like, hey, my PT or my doctor, whoever is going to tell me where the issue is, and I'm just going to have to figure it out based on what they're describing to me. But the telehealth is almost like it's a whole nother layer of the healing process because now it's forcing the individual to take ownership of these are my tendencies. Now I'm being like, now it's a big light shining on these tendencies. I got to figure out how to fix it.
Exactly. Well, and for us too, as providers, like we're essentially our hands are tied behind our back, and
Now you're not doing internal exams via Zoom.
no, no, you've got to go with kind of what's going on in here. So yeah, no, that's definitely something that I think it made me level up for sure. So for you, like, what was the biggest surprise for you as a mom and as a coach? So kind of two separate things. Like once you've had your kids, what's been the biggest surprise for you?
I mean, I think it's ever since that first labor it was that, oh, you can plan all you want. You can have everything laid out. I'm very type A. I like to have a plan and a checklist. But it doesn't matter because not everything's going to go your way. And you really learn to be fluid and to be malleable and to adapt. And I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of, that relates to coaching in many ways because you could have this like great warm up planned and then all of a sudden you've got like a class that's double the size you envisioned, or maybe you have half the
Right.
people and now you got to figure out how do I engage two totally opposite people who aren't going to be interested in working together. Or maybe you get a newbie and you've got a busy class. You're like, okay, well, now I got to adapt to managing this class and supporting this newbie, or whatever it may be. So um my it was a surprise because when you're a independent woman and you don't have children and you don't have you're just kind of focusing on yourself or your
Yep.
partner or whatever it may be, um you're not as you're not as jarred when the unknown happens.
Yeah.
But then when you have to take into consideration other people and their needs, and many times their needs come before your needs, you got to learn how to just kind of roll with it. So
Yeah.
I have learned to let go of a lot of things. My tendencies to be very neat and tidy and organized have definitely gone out the window. And I still have a planner. I love to
That's
write
good.
down and color
Everybody
code.
needs a planner.
And sometimes it feels really refreshing to be like, well, that's not happening today.
Yeah.
So that was definitely the biggest surprise, was just like kind of figuring out how to make the time that is yours worth the time, worth it, get it, be productive.
Yep.
But then just to let go of
Yeah.
things that are out of your control.
Yeah. No, and I think, when I'm working with moms, one of the things that we talk about the most is, um, I'm like, well, how much time or what are your plans? And then what's actually a reality?
Yeah.
And what are the resources you have? And let's set you up to go low hanging fruit sorts of things, because we may think 40 minutes for a workout. Let's start with 5. Let's start with 10 and get that consistent. And I no one's going to judge you. No one's going to think you're a bad person. Like, let's get consistent and kind of build that up and build those wins. But I think, we get on ourselves about, well, this is how I always used to do it. I used to be able, like, meditation for me was incredibly hard postpartum because I thought I needed to have this perfect silence in this perfect place in this perfect amount of time. And when you have a kid that it takes 40 minutes to go down for a 30-minute disaster nap, like that's just, a thing. And it took me so long to realize that something was better than nothing, and
Mhm.
nothing was making things worse. And that showing up sometimes is the goal. Like, maybe, and once you've shown up, maybe you can do a little bit more, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit more. But that's, I feel like that's so hard for moms when they, had everything worked out ahead of time. Um, but yeah, I feel like I'm still working that piece out. I don't know. It
I mean, I
changes
don't
every
think that
day.
yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like that's just our life, right? For the
Yeah,
remainder of
yeah, definitely. Especially
forever.
we're on the cusp here. I guess both of our kids are done with school starting Friday, and so the schedule completely changes. for us for the remainder of June and then July and August. Like my schedule goes on its head completely, and they're the priority for the summer. So I have to shut my work brain off, which is hard for me.
Yes. I've learned that that's not a switch either. It's a dial.
No,
You
it
know,
is a
you got to like
dial.
turn it down, but it's no turning off.
Yeah. Yeah, but what I've been able to do with workouts and stuff, and you're far better than I am at this, is like I now go to the gym at 5:30 in the morning. Is it my favorite? No, but it's done, and it's done before swim practice. It's done before anything else, and I'm not feeling like I'm trying to catch up later on in the day. And so trying to just check those boxes off first, I think it's a practice, but it's good.
Yeah.
All right. So for you, like what advice do you have? You've gone through this, with your two daughters now, you kind of have gone through this as an evolving coach. What advice, what should moms be thinking about, or prospective moms, when they think about kind of returning back to workouts?
So my first piece of advice is to schedule with a PFPT. I mean, it
You're
sounds
so
very like
good.
I'm patting you on your back, but genuinely, I mean, I have had friends, I have had women that I've just connected with who've said, yeah, like what's the first step? And I mean, I have this sort of like very generic email that has YouTube videos with breathing exercises and clamshells and some of the general exercises that you might prescribe, but I'm just like, you know what, everybody's going to be different.
Yeah.
This might feel really extreme for you, this might not feel good enough, but at the end of the day I was like, you working with somebody who can provide some feedback and insight into what you're experiencing, and you also being able to have an open dialogue with that person, is going to make your return to fitness that much smoother.
Yeah.
And I'd never want to say that it's going to be smooth. I never want to say it's not going to be smooth. I just want to just be very matter of fact, like figure out where you are and then start there.
Yep.
Um, and then if you have access to a coach, amazing. But and I always try to say, if you can find a pelvic floor physical therapist that's familiar with athletes and it is not going to discourage you. I mean, there's still people out there who will say, "Oh no,
I
we don't want you
know.
jumping, running." Um, but I feel like thanks to the beauty of the internet and
Right.
social media, I mean, there's such a big network of people who, I know this person in this area, I can
Yep.
connect you there, right? I mean, I
Exactly.
think even with being able to do telehealth, it's like that's better than nothing.
Yep.
And I still think it should be a standard, right? Like that should be 6 weeks postpartum, go see your OB or meet with your midwife and then get your prescription for your
Yeah.
PT.
Yeah, no, and it's funny, in the area that we live in, you can get ultra prepared people. Like I sometimes have women contact me when they're like, they just got their first pregnancy test and it's positive. I'm like, okay, slow your roll here. Like, let's make sure we get through that first trimester, and you don't want to make them too nervous. But um and I do think it helps when people feel like they can have their questions answered, even if they don't know what questions to ask. I mean, my favorite question whenever I'm talking to anybody is, what should I be asking you that I haven't asked? Because
Mm,
that's like, you know what, you know more about this than I do. I have no idea what to even ask you. So tell me what I should know at this point. Tell me what I should prepare for. And I'll have a completely different conversation with somebody that comes to see me, end of first trimester, beginning of second trimester, just for information, versus if you're coming in at 36, 37, 38 weeks, there's like, we can talk basic stuff there, but chances are, my second question is, um, have you made your choices as far as your birth mode and what all that's going to look like, and what are you envisioning postpartum? Because I want to know how far cemented they are into their plans. Again, I feel like, having laminated my first birth plan, I feel like I can say that because I know how that goes. But if you're rigid in it and you don't have much time before delivery, I think we're kind of, our eyes are set on, hey, roll with it, and we'll see what things look like postpartum. But also, I've been trying to get women to come in. We set up their postpartum visit between like 3 and 4 weeks after their due date,
Oh,
because
earlier, yeah.
yeah, actually, and even with C-section too, because like you said, you're like, I don't even know about this glue. Like,
Yeah.
I did not even know. Like, it wasn't until after I had 2 C-sections that I actually went back and looked to see what the surgery was, because nobody even explains it. Like, wait, what are we actually cutting here? What's
Yeah.
happening? So at least have some of those basic questions answered, or pillows or positioning, or you're having feeding issues. I know a great lactation consultant who works virtually or things like that. I think, just having some time to listen before you, or even plan what you said, like, these are some basic exercises. This is what breathing looks like. These are the things that you want to be thinking about, as opposed to don't do a thing until 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So I think there's so much opportunity, like you said, to kind of get information. For you, kind of having seen the good, bad, and the ugly, like, what suggestions do you have as far as vetting information that's online or on social?
That's tough
Yeah.
because I mean, well, I think great, and I believe you said something like this in one of your posts too. It's like anything that speaks to extremes or speaks in absolutes, right? It's always never. I mean, how do you know? Like a lot of this
Yeah.
content that's out there is meant to be helpful for sure, and meant to create authenticity, or to create like to build credibility among these professionals. But a lot of the times it's like, well, does this apply to me? I mean, that's a really
Yeah.
good question. I think it's, looking at the information. I mean, is it evidence-based? Like, where are they getting this information from? Are they
Yeah.
using examples, like real life case studies, or it's and I think that that's really a tricky part of navigating postpartum and pregnancy, because people have so many varying opinions on what's right and what's wrong and what's going to affect the baby and what's going to affect you. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, we also have this lovely thing called intuition, which if you can lean into that a little bit, um,
Yeah.
and the more you can kind of, I like, at least specifically with like social media, I like to have a circle of individuals, and it sort of creates a little bit of an echo chamber of, okay, everyone's saying the same general message. And then how can I take this message and have it apply to me specifically?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you you've got to advocate for yourself, and then also just find people in your circle who can also advocate for you, and that can give you the message that you want to hear.
Yeah. No, I think that's good advice. I had a mentee reach out to me this morning. She's like, "What do you tell somebody when they, oh gosh, what was this thing? That if your foot pronates, you have pelvic floor weakness." I'm like, I don't even know where to start with that. Like, and usually as a good mentor, I'm like, "Well, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
What did you
Like,
say
that's
to
why I'm
her?"
asking you.
Right. And that's where it's funny. I've been noticing more physical therapists being aware of some of these providers that have gone viral, and they haven't showed up overnight. They've been out there for years, but they're just getting, they're getting PR now. And there's some of these PTs are so upset. They're like, this information, it's not correct enough. And I'm like, it's like with media too. It's like, you got to get enough out there to start the conversation, but that is not the gospel. And you've got to
Yes.
go a little bit deeper. And I think it's also understanding too that these voices that are out there, they're the purpose is awareness. The purpose is not to replace a professional or an in-person visit or things like that, but there's a role for it. It's awareness, which, I'll take that over anything. And I think, people like you, being advocates for, go see a provider because you have a little bit more experience with that. Like, it's not like an empty statement for you. You're like, no, this is why I have understanding of this, and I have experience with this. And I think there's so much value to, I think, moms sharing their story, which is, I appreciate why you came on. Because I think if we hear it from somebody that's our job, like, it's one thing, but from you, where you're like, no, 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 like, I've been in this space. I'm a mom. I've got 2 kids. This is what I'm seeing in the rear view. And I think if we continue to pass that on, we're going to have generations of moms that are going to be able to advocate for themselves better because they know what questions to ask, or they know what people to connect with. And I think that's how we're going to continue to change all this. And maybe we get to that, mandatory, we're France
Yeah.
now, right?
Right, exactly. You say we're a little bit behind.
Exactly, exactly. All right. Well, thanks so much for being on. If you want to find Maria in her in her day job,
Yeah.
she is a kick-ass website person. Thank you very much. She's over at mariavieta.com. Thank you so much. I love you so much. You're just like the
Thank
best
you.
energy and just so supportive. And I love watching your workouts. You do Paragon training methods, right? In
I
your
love it.
garage. Love watching. You were an inspiration to me. I'm like, girl is strong as hell. And I love that. And I love that you're on my team. So thank you so
Thank you
much
for,
for
yeah.
for being on and sharing your story. And thanks for taking good care of me.
Always, Carrie. I got you. Well, vice versa. I appreciate
Awesome.
you and thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.